International Women's Day, and I've been reflecting on the power of women's contribution to history, but also particularly feminist contributions over the last 30 years or so. Browsing through my bookcases, bringing up again wonderful books that were foundational for the field. I also realised that it's 30 years since I co-organised a conference at Cornell University with fellow literary critic Mary Jacobus, but also biologist Evelyn Fox-Keller, on body politics, women and the discourses of science. It was a wonderful conference, and I should say it produced a book which is still in publication 30 years on. That project, I realise, has led through to a current one I'm directing, Constructing Scientific Communities, Citizen Science in the 19th and 21st Centuries. What this project is doing is looking at those who've contributed to science who haven't necessarily made it into the historical record, and women are a particular important category there. So you'll hear now from a couple of members of our team who are working on ways in which women have contributed to the history of science in the 19th century.
Well, it's important to recognise that women have often had a role in astronomy, which has often been sidelined by their male colleagues. So it's only historians now that are uncovering the true extent of their involvement and the importance of their contributions. And of these, Elizabeth Beckley is an outstanding example. My name is Lee Macdonald. My main job is in the Museum of the History of Science, where I'm their librarian and archivist. I'm also a historian of science by background and have completed a book on the history of the Kew Observatory. Well, Elizabeth Beckley is she's the first known woman to be actively involved in photographing the sun. I mean, there have been women astronomers before then, going all the way back to at least to Hypatia in the 4th century AD. But in the new science of photography, and especially the slightly offbeat subject of photographing the sun, people tend to think of it as an entirely male-dominated field into the 20th century. But Elizabeth Beckley lived near the Kew Observatory in Surrey. It's actually a slight misnomer because it's now in the parish of Richmond, but never mind. It's still called the Kew Observatory, and the so-called Kew photoheliograph, this sort of dedicated solar telescope, was set up at Kew in the 1850s to photograph the sun every day in an attempt to understand the correlation between solar activity, that's sunspots that is, and variations in the Earth's magnetic field. Well, taking the solar photographs proved to be a very complex and labour-intensive process, and because you needed two people to take every photograph. So you basically needed one person to actually aim the telescope and take the photograph, and another to prepare and develop the plates at the same time. So Kew Observatory was run on a shoestring because the British Association didn't have a great deal of money. So they didn't have money to take on an extra astronomer to actually to do the solar photography. So, but the observatory's mechanical engineer called Robert Beckley, he had a teenage daughter. And so he inspanned her as cheap labour to help take these solar photographs. We don't know for certain what her precise role is. All we know is that Warren de la Rue, who designed the solar telescope, remarked that she looks out every day for suitable intervals of clear sky, and thanks to her there is always a record at Kew, even when the weather is relatively cloudy. So she might well have been the one who actually aimed the telescope and fired the camera shutter. And there is even evidence that she helped to analyse the results of the solar photographs, which meant measuring the positions and the sizes of the sunspots to determine levels of solar activity, which was so that formed part and parcel of the emerging new science of astrophysics. I think we should thank Elizabeth Beckley today for first of all, making this solar photographic project possible on the very limited budget that the Kew Observatory people had at the time, and also for being a very early role model for women in observational astronomy.
I'm Alison Moulds, and I'm a PhD student working on medical practitioners in Victorian Britain. As part of that, I consider the representation of female practitioners. On International Women's Day, we often reflect on the position of women both today and historically. As part of this, I wanted to talk a little bit about my research on 19th century women doctors. We often talk today about the opportunities that are available for women educationally and in work. Many of these debates were also being staged in the 19th century. What work was it suitable for women to do? What educational opportunities should they be able to access? Throughout this period, women made further inroads into the medical profession, and this is quite incredible when we think it's a period in which women hadn't even gained the vote. So when we think of the Victorian medical profession, we often imagine one which is overwhelmingly male. Some of us know the names of a few female pioneers such as Elizabeth Blackwell, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, but few people really know that the medical women movement was a concerted campaign between around the 1860s and 1900s. By 1892, there were as many as 135 women on the medical register in Britain. The history of women in medicine wasn't just a narrative of progress. As well as making various advances, the women faced numerous setbacks. At a relatively early stage in the medical women movement, in 1869, Sophia Jex-Blake, one of the earliest pioneers, and several female peers, were successful in matriculating at the University of Edinburgh. This was a massive achievement because it was the prospect of women graduating with a degree for the first time. However, although the women were able to enter the university, several years later they were prevented from graduating. During their time in Edinburgh, they faced immense hostility from some people within medicine and within the educational institution as well. There's even a story in which the women were pelted with mud and faced insults being hurled at them just because they wanted to attend classes. I think it's really important that we think about some of the real obstacles that these women faced, the real hostility that they had to overcome in order to make their way in the profession. One way in which aspiring medical women made the case was through their writing, both fiction and non-fiction. In the 1890s, a female medical student called Margaret Todd wrote a 3-volume novel called Mona Maclean, Medical Student. Mona is a student at the London School of Medicine for Women, but after failing some of her examinations, she goes on a personal journey to find out more about how she can become a better medical practitioner. Even though medical journals had long been hostile to female practitioners, they were surprisingly positive about Mona Maclean, Medical Student, the novel. Journals such as The Lancet and the Medical Press and Circular published very positive reviews, recommending the book to their mostly male readers. During the 20th and 21st centuries, women came to play a much greater role in the medical profession, and nowadays there are actually more female medical students than there are male. But despite these great advances, women are still sort of marginalised in some aspects of the profession. There are certain branches of surgery, for instance, where women do not figure as such a large presence. Also, we still encounter various prejudices when it comes to women in medicine. There are some commentators who still suggest that having a medical career is incompatible with family life. In recent years, for example, some people have talked about the fact that women doctors have to go part-time, and this has been represented as a burden on the NHS by some commentators. And I think this shows that many of these debates about what role do women have in the profession and the way in which they fought to overcome these obstacles shows that these debates are still very relevant and important today. As a woman, I found studying the history of some of these individuals really inspiring and encouraging. It's amazing and quite incredible to think of how hard some of these individuals had to work just to pave the way for women to enter the profession. They really had to show men that they could equal them, that they could compete with them. In many ways, the bar was set much higher for female medical students and female medical practitioners than it was for their male counterparts. People were expecting or waiting for them to fail, looking for any evidence that might show that women were not capable or competent medical practitioners. they had to overcome many of these prejudices and show that they were both good students and good medical practitioners.